By late 2005, the Pokemon anime was in a tough spot in the US. By then, the show wasn't exactly being aggressively pushed at the forefront as much as the video games and trading cards were. The message was clear and simple. The anime was no longer a huge moneymaker in the US. It was the mid-2000s, and Pokemon as a franchise had found itself in a strange place in America. The video games and trading cards continued to make a healthy profit in sales, though they weren't quite as high as they were during the peak of Pokemania. However, the same couldn't be said for the English dub of the Pokemon anime. While the show was able to maintain a steady level of popularity, unfortunately, said popularity was no longer pulling in the big profits like it did years before, and the executives at both 4Kids and Pokemon USA knew this. So in early 2006, not long after the license agreement with 4Kids expired, Pokemon USA began to handle the licensing through their in-house group. As for producing the anime's English dub, they would go with TAJ Productions, who had aided 4Kids on the dub in the past, to pick up production. But their time doing the dub would ultimately be short-lived, as they would only do 2 seasons of the show, Battle Frontier and the first season of Diamond and Pearl. Afterwards, beginning with the 11th season, DP Battle Dimension, they'd be succeeded by Duart Video and Film. So, what exactly happened? It seems rather bizarre that TAJ only dubbed those 2 seasons, considering they even outbid 4Kids for the job, and why exactly did they stop after Diamond and Pearl? Well, all those questions and more will be covered and answered in today's video. So with all of that, I am the MediaNutso, and it's time for us to take a deep dive into the story behind the TAJ production years of the anime's English dub. Before we get into the main topic at hand, let's first lay out the groundwork of events that eventually culminated in the change-up in the dub's production, starting with Pokemon USA's beginnings. It all began back in Japan in 1998, when Nintendo, Creatures Inc. and Game Freak founded the Pokemon Center Company. At the time, the company was established to manage all of the Pokemon Center stores that were operating across Japan. But as the franchise's popularity took off overseas, especially after the release of Gold and Silver, they were soon flooded with requests for merchandising proposals from various companies across the world. As you might imagine, it was very overwhelming to receive that many proposals, and even more so to have only one person trying to manage it all. This was a problem that Tsunekazu Ishihara, the producer and co-founder of Creatures Inc., knew had to be remedied. So to resolve it, plus wanting to expand the franchise with long-term goals in order for it to continue on, it was decided to expand on the company's operations. Thus, in October of 2000, the Pokemon Center Company was rechristened the Pokemon Company. Then 5 months later, in February of 2001, they established the North American branch, Pokemon USA, to manage the franchise in America. And one of the first deals they made was a 5-year agreement with 4Kids Entertainment, which would allow them to continue producing the English dub of the anime, along with handling all the licensing and merchandising of the show, and acquiring a 3% stake in the company for an undisclosed amount. Gotta say, for the time, that was not too shabby of a deal 4Kids got out of them. So, with all that firmly established, let's really get to the main topic, by leaping forward to 2005. I previously talked about this back in my Pokemon on Kids WB video, so if you want to learn more, I highly recommend you check it out. But for those not in the know, by late 2005, the Pokemon anime was in a tough spot in the US. By this point in time, the show wasn't exactly the big draw of the franchise like it was 5 years earlier. Now, it should be made clear that the problem the show was suffering from was not due to a sharp decline in ratings. In fact, even though it experienced a steady one over time, as many shows typically do, it continued to perform pretty well, consistently ranking in the top 10 Saturday morning broadcasts. No, the real issue was that the show wasn't pulling in as much ad revenue like it did when it first started. To further elaborate on this point, outside of licensing and selling merchandise, the primary way any TV show makes money is by selling ad space to any advertisers looking to market their products. Thus, the better a show performs with certain viewers, the more advertisers willingly pay more money to have their ads played during any given program. So when the anime was the hot property throughout 1999 and 2000, you better believe that advertisers lined up to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to have their ads played during the airing of any episode. However, once Pokemania ended around mid-2001, that revenue steadily declined over the next 4 years. Now, it's certain that the show was still making a decent amount of money in 2005, but it wasn't nearly as much as what it was getting back in its prime. Plus, by then, the show wasn't exactly being aggressively pushed at the forefront as much as the video games and trading cards were. The message was clear and simple. The anime was no longer a huge moneymaker in the US. And as I stated at the beginning, the executives at both 4Kids and Pokemon USA were keenly aware of this. So, in October of 2005, 4Kids liquidated their 3% stake in the company and sold it back to the three parties for $960,000. Then 2 months later, on December 23rd, it was announced that both companies agreed to not renew their agreement deal, which was set to expire on New Year's Eve 8 days later, and starting in 2006, Pokemon USA's in-house group would handle the licensing from there on out. For 4Kids, it really wasn't a huge loss on their end, as they had made a healthy profit of over $140 million from that stake. Plus, by that time, they had other properties they could fall back on, including Yu-Gi-Oh! And their own Saturday morning block on the Fox network, 4Kids TV. They would also still receive commissions on their payments made under the agreement for the next few years, though in shrinking increments. Once the agreement expired and they got control of the licensing, the first thing Pokemon USA did was scout for another company that could produce the English dub for a lower cost. Ultimately, they would go with TAJ Productions to handle the job. Now, TAJ is no stranger when it comes to the Pokemon anime. Going back to the very beginning, they had assisted with 4Kids on producing the dub, first when it was recorded at Button Sound, which was an independent studio that TAJ contracted to record the first 50 plus episodes. That was until they were forced to drop them and move production to their then new facilities, beginning with the episode Princess vs. Princess. From there, they continued to aid 4Kids with production for the next few seasons until Master Quest in late 2003, with the last episode they helped with being You're a Star, Larvitar. Afterwards, starting with the next episode, Address Unknown, production was moved to 4Kids in-house facilities for the remainder of their time, all the way to the end of Advanced Battle. With the dubbing company lined up, the next step was to assemble the cast. As part of an effort to lower production costs, rather than bringing on most of the main cast from 4Kids, they decided to hire an entirely new cast. Now, it is worth noting that this move was not without precedent, as the dub had gone through a handful of cast changes over the years. The two most prime examples of this were Eric Stewart taking over from Ted Lewis as James, and Maddie Blaustein replacing Nathan Price as Meowth. Also, as a couple of then more recent examples, Roger Parsons, aka Ken Gates, who had initially stayed on and narrated the first 20 episodes of Pokemon Advance, was let go from the show, and starting with Witch Wurmple's Witch, he was replaced by Mike Pollock. And when Megan Hollinshed relocated to Los Angeles, they had Bella Hudson take over as Nurse Joy, and Andy Whaley stepping in as Cassidy. The way the team conducted the casting process was interesting to say the least. When searching for the voice actors, they sought to get ones who were the best at imitating the characters' voices. Now, when I say imitating the characters' voices, I don't mean that they were directed to sound like the voice actors they were replacing. No, I meant it literally. They were specifically being directed to replicate how each of the characters' voices had sounded up until that time, like how Ash's voice was distinctly raspy, while Jane's voice had a very fruitful and flamboyant tone. Obviously, their intent was to maintain some consistency from 4Kids and to make the change between voice casts less jarring, which, while it was a noble gesture, the actual execution of it was pretty rocky, but we'll get more into that later. For the new cast members, they hired Bill Rogers to take over as the voice of Brock, and would eventually hire Sarah Natochenny to be the new voice of Ash. On a side note, when Bill Rogers auditioned for the show, he had thought that Eric Stewart voluntarily left the show on his own terms. However, not everyone in the cast was a newcomer to the series. A few 4Kids veterans did make the transition, including but not limited to James Cathcart, aka Billy Beach and Jimmy Zoppi, who had been working on adapting the English scripts beginning on Master Quest, and held on to that position through the changeover, taking over as the voice of James, Meowth, and Professor Oak, while also reprising Gary and Professor Namba. Michele Knotz taking over the roles of Jessie, Misty, Nurse Joy, and May, and Casey Rogers taking over as Max, along with reprising Wobbuffet, and was originally going to be the new voice for Ash, but we'll get into why she didn't later. They were even able to tap Roger Parsons to reprise his role of the narrator, along with voicing a few minor one-off characters. Plus, John Loeffler of Rave Music would continue to write new theme songs for the dub alongside fellow veteran Manny Corallo, and a new composer to help do the score, David Wolford. To give the new cast a trial run, as well as commemorate the 10th anniversary of the franchise, Pokémon USA commissioned a 40-minute TV special, The Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon, and it didn't take long for the cast to record the whole special. No joke, they recorded the entire dub of the special in just 3 weeks. Man, talk about a quick turnaround there. However, just before the special premiered, news about the cast change began to spread through the fandom, and I think you all know where this is going. Around that time, the original 4Kids cast members had learned about the changeover after they had wrapped production on Advanced Battle, and in a twist of fate, the end of season wrap party quickly turned into a farewell party. From there, many fans emailed some of the actors to see if what they heard about the change was true, to which they confirmed that it was indeed happening. As you might have guessed, many fans were not very happy to hear this news. But there was also a subsection that wanted to give the new cast a fair chance. So, when The Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon premiered on Kids WB on Saturday, April 29, 2006, to say its reception was very mixed would be a huge understatement. Many fans absolutely hated the special for the plot and conflict, but mostly for the new cast performances as the characters. However, those that were fairer to it thought that it was a decent special, and enjoyed it for reuniting most of the original cast, presenting some good action, and for having somewhat of a darker edge. But that wasn't enough to deter the backlash that followed. After the special's broadcast, Pokémon USA was flooded with hundreds of thousands of emails from fans expressing their feelings about the special and the cast. And much to their credit, they really listened to it. So much so that later on at the 2006 Comic-Con International, Pokémon USA announced that the new voice for Ash would be then newcomer Sarah Natochenny instead of Casey Rogers as originally planned, and that they were going to go back and redub the Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon with Natochenny redoing all of Ash's lines. But those weren't the only changes. They also had Michele Knotz and Bill Rogers redo all of May and Brock's lines, which did end up sounding better as by then they were more settled into their roles. The redubbed version of the special would premiere on Cartoon Network on October 28th and was released as part of the 2-disc DVD edition of Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. Another notable tidbit about the redub. For whatever reason, there were some bits of dialogue that were redone from the original version. It was mostly just some small word changes, with 5 bits coming from Ash and 1 bit from Brock. With all that being said, it wasn't just the fans who were upset with the special. The higher-ups at Kids WB weren't too thrilled with it either. Because of that, along with the show's declining ratings, a renewed focus on Warner Bros. In-house productions, dropping every other anime except for Spider Riders, and Kids WB being elected to move to the then newly formed CW network in the fall, the anime would officially end its 7-year run on the block after the final new episode of Advanced Battle, Hasta la Vista, on July 8, 2006. though it would continue to air in reruns up until September 16th. And the 9th season, Pokemon Battle Frontier, would premiere on Cartoon Network on September 8th, just 1 week before the show officially left Kids WB. Now, before we get into talking about Battle Frontier itself, there's one other aspect that we need to touch upon. Let's go back to the Pokemon on Kids WB video for a moment. At the end of that video, I talked about the reasons why Pokemon USA didn't just bring all the original cast over and gave an educated guess as to why else they didn't do so. However, as I found out, there was more to it than what was initially mentioned. See, while the cast was under contract with 4Kids, said contracts didn't have any kind of exclusivity clause. However, they did have a sunset clause that forbade the actors from continuing to perform any roles they did at 4Kids for another company for a certain amount of time, which in this instance was for only 1 year. After Pokemon USA decided to no longer work with 4Kids, the actors went to President Norman J. Grossfeld and asked if the company was going to honor that clause, to which Grossfeld stated that he never gave them advice on what decision they should make, and that they never actually enforced that clause. Frankly, that does explain why many of the voice actors were able to return to the show a couple of years later, but we'll get more into that down the line. Plus, if I may add, it wouldn't have been a great idea to have the English dub stop production for a year and then resume on the following one, as it likely would have made the production a lot more hectic and pushed the dub further behind. That would not have been good in any way, given that one of Pokemon USA's long-term plans was to have the dub not be too far behind the original Japanese airings. Also, it would have been pretty jarring for them to suddenly switch voice actors again, especially in the middle of an ongoing series. On top of that, and this is more related to the dub overall, the one trade-up was that the dub would go through much less localized changes, with a few exceptions of course, and over time, the script started to be more faithful to the original Japanese versions, both for better and for worse. So now that we've gone through and covered all of that, let's finally get into discussing how the 2 seasons played out. When Battle Frontier made its debut on Cartoon Network, fans were still very split about the cast. Many still weren't too keen on them and either stopped watching the dub and or switched to watching the sub version, or watched the dub just to see the entire Battle Frontier arc all the way through and then dropped it altogether. But others wanted to be fair and give them a chance to come into their own as the characters. So outside of the Mastermind or Mirage Pokemon, how did the cast fare at the beginning? Well, much of the roughness from the special was buffed out and some of the cast members were more settled into their roles. Of course, Roger Parsons easily slipped back in as the narrator, as well as KZ Rogers stepping back in as Wobbuffet, and Michele Knotz and James Cathcart were more familiar with their characters. Also, trivia note, when Cathcart did Meowth's voice, he didn't attempt to imitate the way Matty Blaustein had done the voice for years, and instead did his own take on the character's voice, which good on him for doing so. As for James, he intentionally changed the way the voice had been done when Eric Stewart voiced him, as he wanted to give James a softer side and vary up what he can express emotionally. However, when it came to Bill Rogers and Sarah Natochenny, well, yeah, there's no other way around it. They were pretty rocky at the beginning of the season. Now, just to clarify, this is not a slam against the two, as I'm certain they were doing their best with how they were directed at the time, but their performances early on were very rough and lackluster, and occasionally it came off like they were trying too hard to replicate the original voices. For example, Sarah's ass voice sounded a lot more throaty and gravelly than raspy.
Pikachu, use thunder! I'm so ready! Leaf Blade, let's go!
Of course, at this point in the show's run, they were new to voicing these characters and hadn't quite come into their own yet, and in Sarah Natochenny's case, getting used to the process of dubbing an anime, though she caught on to it pretty quickly. So naturally, they were going to sound rough at first. Fortunately though, as the season went on, the two did get better at voicing the characters. Also, it wasn't that the two didn't know how to act beforehand. Quite the opposite. Sarah Natochenny had briefly studied acting before she was cast, but at the time, she hadn't done any voice acting before, much less worked on an English dub for an anime. And in fact, Ash was her very first voice acting role, so you can imagine it was tricky for her to get into it at first, especially since she was taking over from Veronica Taylor. That, and she was only 18 years old when she started. As for Bill Rogers, he did have acting experience in both television and on stage before he was cast as Brock, with only one other anime voice role he had done beforehand, the Prime Minister in the English dub of Assemble Insert. But as I already said, they got better at performing the voices over the course of production. Now, what's not often discussed about the changeover is that the cast wasn't the only thing that changed during production. Although TAJ Productions returned to produce the dub, not all of the crew members from the original tenure with 4Kids came back, and some that did ended up being shuffled to different positions. Now, some did retain their original ones, like Larry Juris as producer, and as mentioned earlier, James Cathcart working on adapting the English scripts, but others took on new ones. Probably the most notable one was Armin Mazlamian. He had previously served as the sound supervisor final mixer and was one of the ADR engineers from Princess vs. Princess to Your Star Laritar, and was now not only back as audio engineer mixer, but he was also the new voice director for the series. What's so fascinating about Mazlamian becoming the voice director is that he had no experience doing voice directing in other projects. Like with the cast, I'm sure Mazlamian was a fine person and did the best job he could, but it was apparent he was very hit or miss with his directing, particularly early on in the season where it seemed like he had the actors only do 1 or 2 takes of each line, though he did get better by the time Diamond and Pearl rolled around. Interestingly though, the show wasn't the only thing the cast was working on. Around that same time, in addition to doing the 9th movie, Pokémon Ranger and the Temple of the Sea, they were also doing voice work for the educational website, the Pokémon Learning League. Click here to learn more about that, which had started development in January of 2006, not long after Pokémon USA acquired the licensing from 4Kids. What's notable about the website is that while recording of the anime was done at TAJ, recording of the Learning League was done at Duart Video and Film, who of course would later take over production of the dub, though TAJ did record some of the early lessons. Also, given that the website was in production prior to the premiere of the Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon, this of course meant some of the early lessons made were recorded with KZ Rogers voicing Ash. As a result, for the lessons that were already completed, like the Lunar Cycle and Fractions, they were released pretty much intact. That was except for one small change. They later had Sarah Nanochenny go in and record a couple of new lines, though it was only the bits where Ash was addressing the mission guides by name. If you pay close attention, you can tell when the voice briefly changes from KZ Rogers to Sarah Nanochenny and vice versa.
That's true. And some nights you can't see the moon at all.
I wonder if there is a way to know for sure if the moon will be out.
Sierra at the Learning League lab would know. Let's give her a call on the Pokepilot. Hey, Sierra, can you help us out? Let's see if we can get some help on this. Ada at the Learning League lab is really good at solving problems. She'll be able to help us out.
It is rather weird that this happened, but it's also pretty fascinating. Now, this is just a bit of speculation, but it's likely that working on the Learning League helped the cast get a better grasp on their characters, as it allowed them to loosen up their performances and thus weren't nearly as rough sounding as they had been at the beginning of Battle Frontier. Anyways, getting back onto the show, when it came to the one-off or minor characters, their performances were very hit or miss. Some of them were perfectly fine and suitable, while others were really stilted and wooden, to the point where it sounded like all of their lines were done in one take, which wouldn't be surprising to learn if that's what actually happened. Once again, to be completely fair, the actors that got to voice some of them probably didn't have a lot of time to prepare or familiarize themselves, and just performed with the directions they were given. As for some of the Pokemon voices, they would use archive recordings from older episodes to fill in the roles, like for Maze Squirtle and for Voltorb, just to name a couple. Overall, the cast did a relatively decent job with taking over as the characters. Yes, they were rough and stilted sounding at the start, but they gradually warmed up to them and some were able to get into their roles easier than others. But this was only the beginning for them, as they would progressively get better as the series went on for the next few seasons. Now, for those of you that remember watching Battle Frontier as it was premiering on Cartoon Network, you may recall catching a few glaring errors in some of the early episodes. For example, in a chip off the old Brock, the Pokédex referred to Marshtomp as the Mud Pokemon, and a little later, Max says that Mud Shot is an Earth-type attack. Or in Wheel of Frontier, Ash mispronounces Medicham as Medicam. Of course, errors like that were not unusual or uncommon for the dub. I mean, need I point to probably the most egregious example of this?
Trainers, which one of these Pokemon evolves into Seviper? If you chose Arbok, you were right.
However, the main difference with those errors versus these ones is that the crew later went back and redubbed those lines in order to correct them. And ever since, every subsequent rerun and home media release would use those updated versions. While it was admirable the team made that move, the one catch to it was that it made it obvious which lines were redone, as the new recordings didn't exactly match up with how the voices sounded through the rest of the episodes. They could have easily fixed that by just re-recording all the lines in full as they did with the first example, but hindsight is 2020. Also, starting with this season, the English openings would be shortened from 1 minute to 30 seconds, as most intros to Cartoon Network shows at the time were that long, though with a few exceptions, and to accommodate for more commercial space. With all that said, for Pokemon USA, even with all those changes, all that really mattered was how well the show was performing. And on that note, despite the initial fan reception, Battle Frontier had overall performed decently well. Sure, its ratings weren't quite like they were during Pokemania, but it did well enough for the show to continue on, which it would with the next series, Diamond and Pearl, which first premiered on April 20th, 2007 as part of a special preview, as well as to coincide with the American release of the Diamond and Pearl games, then was later played in the correct order on June 4th. So, with the new season and cast of characters, how did the cast fare this time around? Well, by this point in the show's run, much of the cast had begun to get more comfortable with voicing their characters. Yes, some of the voices still sounded a little rough, but now they were much more familiar with them and were allowed to be much more flexible. As a result, their performances weren't nearly as stilted as they had been during Battle Frontier and began to sound more natural, like how Ash's voice was noticeably much less gravelly. Now, when it comes to the new cast members that were hired on, given that they were voicing newer characters, they weren't nearly as restrained in how they were directed to do the voices and thus have more room to settle in. Of course, their performances weren't entirely perfect, as they would sometimes sound a bit stilted and had some occasional slip-ups, but that got ironed out as the season progressed. Probably the standout ones of the bunch were Emily Jennis as Dawn, and Julian Rabelito, apologies if I mispronounced that, as Paul. Jennis was able to bring the right energy and quirky enthusiasm to Dawn, which makes sense as her character was just beginning her journey, as well as occasionally being a little witty and snarky, while Rabelito got the stoic and no-nonsense serious tone for Paul. As for the others, Bill Rogers had started to come into his own by the end of Battle Frontier, and at this point he was much more settled in as Brock. As for Sarah Natochenny, now that she had gotten a better grasp on her character and was given more leeway, she began to iron out a vocal take that best suited her natural voice, which did result in her Ash voice sounding slightly higher pitched during this time.
We were wondering, what's with all the boxes, Nurse Joy? The center isn't closing, is it? Piplup looks great, Dawn. And Zoe, you and Glammeow are in top form. Pikachu!
But once she got a take that worked, that was when she truly began to come into her own as the character, and eventually made the role her own just as Veronica Taylor did. By late 2007, shortly before production on the season wrapped, another big change would soon take place. On January 2nd, 2008, Larry Juris announced that TAJ was no longer going to be working on the show, and that beginning with the 10th movie, The Rise of Darkrai, Duart Video and Film would assume the production. The final episode, TAJ dubbed Smells Like Teen Spirit, premiered on February 1st, 2008. and it also marked the final use of any background music that was originally produced by 4Kids. So what happened to TAJ after that? Did they go on to produce more shows? Well, not exactly. It was rumored for a long time that TAJ had shut down completely in early 2009. But in actuality, what happened was that TAJ got disbanded and was reformed as TAJ Mania Entertainment. Today, they still create and produce original music for many projects along with making original animated productions. However, they haven't dubbed any more anime since then. Well, gotta admit, that was an unexpected trajectory that they took. As for Duart, they would go on to produce the dub for the next 11 years up until the end of Sun and Moon Ultra Legends. When Duart first began on DP Battle Dimensions, more noticeable changes had occurred. As the series' popularity was steadily rising again, the production didn't have as low a budget like it had in the past 2 seasons. As a result, along with the 1-year sunset clause expiring, several veterans from 4Kids were able to return, including but not limited to Sean Schemmel, Dan Green, Lisa Orditz, Mike Pollock, Ted Lewis, Bella Hudson, and most notably, the late Maddie Blaustein for one of the Mystery Dungeon specials, in what would be her final voice role before her passing as Chatot, and of course the late Rachel Lillis returning to voice Malin. While their time dubbing the show may have only been a couple of years, TAJ still left a noteworthy chapter in the anime's history, as it marked a transitionary period for the dub, and probably the one positive aspect to come from it was that it ensured the show's longevity and success in the US, as it's still airing new episodes to this very day. Overall, TAJ's tenure of producing the English dub of the Pokémon anime was short-lived, but was also pretty significant. Sure, it started off rather rocky, but they were able to iron out a lot of the kinks with the cast, even if some of them took a little longer than others, and allowed them to truly grow into their roles and made them their own, and helped set the precedent the anime's dub would follow for the next decade and a half. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and that it gave you great insight into this time frame in Pokemon history. If you'd like to see more like it, please be sure to subscribe to my channel as well as leave a like on the video. Also, if you'd like to help support my channel, please be sure to pledge to my Patreon at patreon.com/MediaNutso, where for just $3 a month, you'll get early access to the newest videos and Pokemon art pieces a full 2 days before they go public and other exclusive perks. With that said, did you stick with the anime after the whole dubcast changeover or not? Be sure to comment your thoughts down below. Until next time, this is MediaNutso saying thank you all very much, and I'll see you on the next one.